So you want to learn how to autofocus on a Nikon D5200, 5300, 5500, and 3400. I'll show you how in this video. So when it comes to using Nikon cameras, I know Nikon cameras, one of the biggest downfalls of using one of these is that it has a horrible autofocusing system. And if you haven't watched the first part of this video, link is in the description or in the comments of the very first part of how you actually understand how to use Nikon cameras and autofocus. And all you essentially do is just half press the shutter and make sure you're on AFS, and the camera should detect you. So if I move up here and I half press the shutter, I'm in focus. And if I'm here, half press again. How do I focus on a Nikon if the subject is constantly moving and you're behind the camera? Well, there's essentially two schools of thoughts here. The first one, which I'm going to talk about, is understanding follow focus on a Nikon camera. So when you have a target or a subject or client that you're trying to track and they're constantly moving, what you want to do is something I call follow focusing. And it's essentially what it sounds like. You're pretty much moving the focus ring here so that it can essentially follow the focus of wherever your target or subject is going. So what you want to do is you put your lens on manual, or if you don't have AF to manual option on your lens, you want to go manual on the display settings, and now you should be able to manually focus. So essentially what follow focusing is you're taking a subject and you're following them with your focus. And it takes practice and understanding the markers on your focus ring. And most focus rings, well, obviously besides the exception of the Nikon kit lens, is that most focus rings have something called 0 to infinity. And this is infinity, in other words, everything in the back, that is where the focus plane is at. And think of the focus ring, every time I turn the focus ring, the plane of focus goes closer and closer and closer to the screen. And I'm out of focus, but here should be in focus. And essentially that is follow focus. So you get practice by moving a subject or having your friend and just focusing and following them around. And when it comes to like manually focusing, it takes practice. And it also depends on the type of lens, whether or not your lens has a deep follow focus or a very short throw when it comes to focusing on the ring. So it really depends. That is one of the, I would say, more advanced level. And even when it comes to movie directors and movie sets, there's someone on the camera whose job is just to follow focus. The second school of thought when it comes to autofocusing on a Nikon and how do you track focus on a Nikon if the subject is moving, well, you don't really focus. Let me explain. So essentially what you want to do is you want to put your f-stop or your aperture all the way to the highest value where it's not completely, you're losing all of light, but make sure it's something at f8, f16, where essentially almost everything is in focus. So that way if you're moving, you can't really tell if your subject is in focus or not in focus because literally almost everything is in focus. I know it sounds a little confusing, but let me explain here on the camera. So what you want to do is, since Nikon you can't change the aperture in live view, you want to get out of live view, hit the display, and then make sure you change your aperture all the way up, because 3.5 is still a shallow depth of field. The higher the number is on the f-stop, the more likely you're going to lose light, but everything will be more in focus. As you can see here, we lost a lot of light, which you can either bump up the ISO or lower the shutter speed to compensate. But as you can see, now more of the background is in focus or more clear because essentially your depth of field has just reduced dramatically. So for the purpose of this video and understanding how you follow focus or have everything in focus when the subject is moving, you essentially bump up the f-stop. The higher the f-stop, the more likely everything is to be in focus with the less of a shallow depth of field. So as you can see here at f22, I have to bump up the ISO to 5000, which it looks horrible. But as you can see here, like the background, you can see pretty clearly. And when I focus on me, you can't even tell that, you know, there's no really bokeh effect. I don't really blur out the background. And as you can see right now, I'm shooting at f2.8. So there is a little bit of background blur or bokeh, and the plane of focus is in here now, and is that shallower depth of field. But when you want to constantly track someone and they're moving, all you essentially do on a Nikon camera, because the Nikon autofocus system is horrible, is what I recommend is you manually focus. And if it's outdoors and they're constantly moving, then up the f-stop to have more likely of a likelihood of your chance having that subject be in focus. So as you can see now, you can see what I'm focusing on is much more clear compared to when I was at f22. And that is how I autofocus and focus on a Nikon D5200 while the subject is moving, or I have to constantly focus on something that's always moving. Follow focus and upping the f-stop. You don't really use autofocus when the subject is moving, because as you can't tell, like if I constantly move, the camera is always gonna try to hunt. And that's not pretty when it comes to video, which is why even cinematic movies that you see on TV or whatever, they all have something called a grip or assistant video operator that helps them with the follow focus. And that is how I focus on a Nikon camera. When it comes to video, Nikon isn't the best choice, but it's what I have, and it always will have a soft spot in my heart. And those are the tips and tricks on how I use this camera. My name is Peter, and we all start from nothing, but you can always create something.